Okay, let's now turn our attention to then the sermon delivered just a few hours later, like the next day, by Bishop Mariann Edgar Budde. But first, do you remember Toys R Us? So growing up, Toys R Us was like the mecca of toy stores. We didn't have one in our small town. We had to settle for KB Toys. Did you have those? That's like the Temu knockoff of Toys R Us. But I'll never forget the first time driving north to the big city to go to Toys R Us for the first time. I mean, you walk in, the ceilings just go to the sky, the shelves go all the way up, all the different sections of games and board games and video games just organized in this meticulous way where you walk through. I mean, it was just an unbelievable experience as a kid. I'll just never forget it. Now, imagine going through all that like as an adult, which is, by the way, harder to do nowadays. I was looking at the history of Toys R Us, like the bankruptcy, and they closed all the stores a few years ago, but now they're like reopening them, oftentimes inside of Macy's. Anyway, what is this, an infomercial for Toys R Us? Maybe it is. Hey, want to be a sponsor? Okay, so imagine being an adult, walking through the Toys R Us, and then coming out the exit, heading to your car, turning to your friend, because evidently in this thought scenario, you brought another adult friend with you to walk through Toys R Us. And you turn to them and say, meh, that wasn't really a toy store. What? Like that level of disconnect from reality is what I experienced last week when people listened to Reverend Budde's sermon at the service of prayer for the nation, and at best said things like, that wasn't very Christian, and at worst called it propaganda or heretical. It's like, what? There's one guy, I'm not going to quote him or link to him or anything, but whatever, a guy who has a big platform out there, who said the following. He said, it was good that America got to witness what the subversion of the church and our Christian institutions look like in all of its ugly glory, in live time and on a mass scale. This guy just sort of looked right at us and said, that's not a toy store. Bro, what are you smoking? Okay, so bizarre. So let's run then a similar analysis of Mariann Budde's message that we did with Franklin Graham's prayer. Reminder, 4 categories, the Bible passages used, the themes employed, what their big idea was, and then how, if it did, resonate with what we know about Jesus. So number 1, what were the Bible passages that Reverend Budde utilized? Go through them real quick. Matthew 5:44. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who harass you. Luke 6:36. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Matthew 6:14. If you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. Mark 2. When Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him. James 2. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can this faith save them? Faith by itself, if not accompanied by works or action, is dead. Leviticus 19, the foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as you love yourself, for you once were foreigners in a different land. So whereas all of Reverend Graham's references came from the Old Testament, Reverend Budde pulled all except for that last one from the New Testament, and almost all from the Gospels. So right away, it's no wonder that her message sounded, to ears that were being honest, sounded like Jesus. In choosing his Bible verses, Graham highlighted themes of victory and blessings of the material kind, rulership, but this moves us to category number 2 of the analysis. The themes that come to mind with the choices from Reverend Budde are themes like mercy and love and hospitality. If you recall the contrast they made between Franklin Graham's Old Testament verses about kings and rulers and power with Jesus's attitude and posture toward those things, and how does it Jesus rejected people that tried to make him king. He refused to take power over people. He said that his kingdom is not even of this world. By the way, quick note. Doesn't it sometimes feel like Christians who resonate with like the kind of prayer that Graham uttered, even more so those who kind of lean into this Christian nationalistic view of things, doesn't it seem like they would have fit in really, really well with the Jews of the first century who wanted to make Jesus their king. And by the way, that's not a compliment. Like, if the company that would be cheering you on are the people who totally missed the point of what Jesus was doing and saying and about, you may want to rethink your theology. Okay. Anyway, where were we? Okay. So the passages from Scripture that Bishop Budde pulled from, in contrast to Graham's, it emphasizes the importance of things like showing love to people, especially those that we disagree with, or those who might be referred to as outsiders or strangers or foreigners in this land. She quoted verses that illuminated Jesus' teaching on the imperatives, not the suggestions, the imperatives to show mercy, to grant forgiveness. And mercy, if you need a quick definition, is the decision not to give someone what they deserve. If grace is to give someone what they don't deserve, like a good thing, woohoo. Mercy is to withhold giving someone what they do deserve. It's to not give a kind of judgment or consequence. Mercy is a compassionate response, for example, to those who have maybe done something wrong. And I'll say this, by the way. Governments don't have to be merciful. This is not the takeaway where I'm like, yeah, and therefore America should be merciful. Look, we can sort of treat these as different things. Governments don't have to be merciful. You could even argue that governments choosing to show mercy, like if and when they do it, should be done with great care and maybe not all that often. Meaning we actually, I think, want governments that can be relied upon to consistently and ethically uphold the laws and the expectations of society. Justice should be consistent and predictable. I am not going to die on the hill of the president should be merciful. But you know what hill I will die on? Christians absolutely should be merciful. On this point, there is no wiggle room. Now, how that tangibly plays out, especially if like a certain Christian is a person in a position of authority and a power, like a high-ranking government official, that is admittedly complex. That's a whole different conversation that is way above my pay grade. But at a fundamental level, my point is, if you claim to be a Christian, then you are making a claim to be a kind of person who chooses mercy, who chooses love, who chooses forgiveness every freaking time. Like, this is what it means to claim to be a Christian. If you're not actively practicing mercy, or not even trying to, or worse, if you think that mercy is somehow wrong, then your claims to follow the way of Jesus make no sense to me. One more thought on this point. I'll just throw this out. I'll just say this. I also fully submit that the matter of immigration is also endlessly complex. For one, like my own opinion is that something like open borders is not necessarily a great option considering this world that we currently inhabit. Sure, on paper and in theory, it sounds really lovely, but in practice, I'm not really sure it contributes to a more peaceable, just, or equitable society. It's just super complicated. That being said, I just want to come back to that if a Christian does not, at least in their heart of hearts, have an attitude toward the outsider that begins with the place of hospitality, charity, and kindness, then you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. Just maybe stop calling yourself Christian. Okay, so those are some of the themes that showed up. What about the big idea? What's the big idea of Mariann Budde's sermon from last week? The big idea for me is so blindingly obvious that if you read the whole thing or listened to the whole thing, but I think a lot of her detractors or a lot of people that didn't like what she had to say really didn't listen to it, the full thing, or just kind of chose to miss the point. But the big idea clearly was unity. There's like, this is what her point was. You can do this on your own time. I did it. Super fun. Do a word search for unity in Mariann Budde's sermon transcript, and it shows up a whopping 20 times. 20 times in a 14-minute sermon. That means more than once a minute she's talking about unity. Here's a few quick quotes. I won't pull all of them, but here's some things she said about unity. We gather this morning to pray for unity, not for agreement, political or otherwise, but for the kind of unity that fosters community across diversity and division, a unity that serves the common good. Here's another one. Unity is not partisan. Rather, unity is a way of being with one another that encompasses and respects our differences. Here's another. Unity at times is sacrificial in the way that love is sacrificial. It's a giving of ourselves for the sake of another. How good is that? Here's another quote. She says, the first foundation for unity is honoring the inherent dignity of every human being. And if I need to explain to you why, as a Christian, that matters, we got a whole other video coming. One of the people, when I shared that meme the other day, one of the people who pushed back and disagreed with me made the claim that her sermon was propaganda, they said. I'm like, what do you mean? And when they shared more about what they meant, which I appreciated, they said they were really just referring to the last 2 minutes of her sermon, in which she specifically referenced scared LGBTQ people and frightened migrants. But propaganda? When you look at the whole sermon, that's a stretch, bro. That is not propaganda. But did she, especially at the end there, maybe suggest or refer to some positions that some people disagree with? Yeah, of course. Of course. But that kind of takes us back to the main point of the entire talk, doesn't it? Which is unity. Can we as a nation find ways to come together on our core values, even while disagreeing on matters of policy and social matters? That was her point. That was her prayer. And I kind of agree with her when she said, we are right to pray for God's help as we seek unity, for we need God's help. God help us indeed. Okay, finally, how did her message connect with or resonate with what we know about Jesus? And I think this is pretty clear. It shouldn't be a surprise that hearing Bishop Budde's sermon would make someone think of Jesus. Of course it does. I mean, not only were his own words used throughout her talk, but the whole vibe of her sermon was rich with the kinds of things that were central to who Jesus was and what he was about. I know that people, like the guy I mentioned a minute ago, disagree with this. And the backlash from not a lot, but a backlash from some of the more conservative Christians to Bishop Budde's sermon, it was strangely vicious. But I would bet $1 million, and I don't have $1 million. I barely have 12. I would bet $1 million on the following. Take any conservative Christian who disagreed with or did not like what she had to say. Go back a couple months ago and plop that Christian in a pew or a chair, if they're a cool, hip evangelical, on a Sunday morning at their church, and have their pastor deliver get the transcript of Bishop Budde's sermon and just have them just say that. Just let that be their message. I bet you $1 million that same person would walk away thinking, man, that sounded a lot like Jesus. It's only because of the prejudices that all of us, myself included, it's only because of the prejudices that we carry that predispose us to disagree with people on the other side. That causes us to hear them in the worst possible light. That causes us to pick out one or two things that we dislike and then disregard the rest. That causes us to mistrust the intentions of the speaker in such a way that makes it so that we totally miss the actual things they're saying. If you walk out of a Toys R Us store and pronounce, not a toy store, you are telling on yourself in some rather embarrassing ways. And man, have Christians been doing that these past couple weeks. Okay, let me bring this to a close. Just imagine you exist somewhere out in the universe. Maybe you're a disembodied entity, and somewhere out in the universe you hear echoes of these 5 phrases. Well, you can't be totally disembodied because you have to have your experience and who you are. Anyway, just whatever. Imagine that you hear the following 5 things just spoken out loud. Love your enemies. Forgive people. Be merciful as God is merciful. Be at unity with one another. Fellowship with sinners and with outsiders. If you just heard those 5 things in a vacuum, is there anyone in particular that would come to your mind? when you hear those things? Of course there is. Jesus. I mean, this is some of the lowest hanging fruit of things that sound like Jesus. In fact, if things that sound like Jesus were the category in Family Feud, all of those five sentiments or phrases, all of them would be on the board of answers and be enthusiastically celebrated by Steve Harvey. And it's not even close. Of course they would be. So my suggestion, sorry, this is a long video. We're doing great. Way to land the plane, Colby. My suggestion to you and all of us is this. If your Christianity is not defined by the heart of Jesus, if it doesn't sound like something Jesus would do, if it doesn't echo some of the main things that Jesus taught about, then I don't think your Christianity is all that Christian. So can we try and do better about keeping the Christ in Christian?